Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. If you've been following along this season, you know that we've been exploring questions around systemic change in organizations. Last month, I spoke with Nanuka Sakia about how leaders can start to affect system-level change in their organizations. And as we know, leadership buy-in and commitment to equity is essential. Today, though, I want to focus on how we can enable all employees to see themselves as system shapers. For true change to happen with organizations, we really need to be able to do this at scale, and that means activating all employees. So for today's question, I'm asking, how can you make equitable innovation at scale? And to answer today's question, I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Liesch. Kristen, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to dig into this topic.
Thank you for having me, Melissa. I am equally excited.
So just before we dig in, I want to tell you a little bit more about Kristen. Kristen was named a Forbes D&I Trailblazer. Kristen is a provocative thought leader and disruptive entrepreneur in the DEI space. Her rigorous and research-based thought leadership has shifted how entire organizations and many DEI practitioners around the world think about the goals and tools in the traditional DEI toolkit. She's the co-CEO and co-founder of Tidal Equality. Kristen is also the co-creator of the Equity Sequence, which gives people around the world an elegant and practical framework for making equitable change through their day-to-day work and decision-making, wherever they work, learn, and play. At the end of the day, Kristen is an impatient person serving other impatient people with the tools they need to accelerate the pace of change to a more equal and just world. So, Kristen, I think it's funny that your bio was talking about impatience because that was what spurred our initial conversation before we sat down to record. And it was what led us to this question: how do we enable equity at scale within organizations?
Absolutely. You're right. That impatience to see equitable change happen more quickly for more people in more situations and settings and regions and so on. It's felt by many people, some who see themselves like yourself as DEI advocates and others who really just feel like they're your everyday folks just trying to get through their day and through their lives and steward their families and communities in the best ways they can. And when we look out at the DEI landscape today in terms of what's available to people, what kind of tools they have access to, there is a real limit. We've got a lot we can get our hands on in terms of education. We can read, we can engage with various communities and support groups and advocates, and we can become educated around issues that folks face, equity-seeking groups and so on, different regional considerations. But when it comes to taking that education and that intention to both be people and part of movements that create equitable change, there's a disconnect between that education and what people can do to action on their intent. And so that creates frustration, that creates impatience, and it's really a gap that myself and my co-founder intended to help close when we created the Equity Sequence. But back to your question, how do we create equitable change at scale? And how do we activate everyday individuals to become part of that change? It comes down to another one question, which is, do you make decisions? Do you make decisions that impact people? And everyone in your audience can ask themselves that. And my guess is most people in your audience are going to answer yes to that. Whether they run a rock climbing gym, or they are a school teacher, or they are a bank teller, or they run a gutter cleaning service, most people will answer yes, I make decisions that impact people. And it's when we make decisions that impact people that we have an opportunity to take those everyday decisions that seem like they're just part of the status quo, that they don't have great impact, and consider them from a new angle, consider them as opportunities to expand equity, to expand inclusion, to expand justice, and to create greater diversity. Now, that might seem a little bit nebulous to people out there who are going like, how, as a person who runs a climbing gym, how can I expand equity? At the end of the day, all of the systems and businesses and infrastructure and services that we encounter, they have been created by someone or by people making decisions. And in most cases, the people who have made decisions that created the infrastructure of everything around us, they have tended to be and continue to be relatively homogeneous groups of people, similar people who hold the most power in a given community or business or organization or city and so on. You get the picture. And so they've really only been created to serve people best like that. I mean, you might take, for example, and right now on many people's minds, we've got the economy and we've got banking systems, we've got lending systems and borrowing systems. If we were all to kind of close our eyes and use a little bit of conjecture and imagine what the decision-making table looks like when things like criteria for credit lending is created, or the criteria and thresholds for mortgage lending and so on are created, when we look at that table, do we imagine or do we see when we Google those banks and executives see a whole lot of diversity at that table? No, we don't. And that doesn't mean that the decisions they make are intentionally malevolent, but the outcomes can be biased and discriminatory to groups that haven't been considered, perspectives that haven't been taken into account. And so it's when we take everyday decisions that we have either the opportunity to disrupt what we've always done, always, which frankly, it's when we don't disrupt it, it is going to inadvertently incorporate our personal biases that we may or may not be aware of. We can let it go on and carry on, or we can pause and say, you know what, I'm going to slow down my thinking here for a second. And when I'm planning this week's team meeting, I'm going to pause and I'm going to consider the people coming to that meeting. I'm going to consider whose voices are weighing in on my decisions about where to host, when to host that meeting, whether to take it on Zoom or whether to make it live. I'm going to consider those perspectives. And that's really what inclusive decision-making looks like. And that is the beginning of what can become a snowball effect of inclusive and equitable change when everyday decisions take a pause to consider who's making the decision, who is on the impact side of that decision, recognizing that there is a gap usually that lives between that decision maker and those who are the receiving end of the decision, and closing it, bringing in those perspectives, bringing in those considerations, whether, again, to my analogy before, we're considering decisions happening at a climbing gym, pricing, accessibility, hours, signage, whether we're a school teacher talking about classroom resources, communications home to caregivers, whether we're talking a bank teller, regardless of the person, where they sit in a business and what kinds of decisions they make, if they impact people, they can be made to be more inclusive, more equitable.
So let's talk about that. Obviously, I'm on board with you here, and I'm wondering, folks are sitting here thinking, okay, so what does this actually look like? So how do I get the person? Obviously, we've talked a lot about leaders, how they can have this trickle down effect. Obviously, what leaders can last for so long. What happens when leaders leave? And so how do you ensure that this is embedded throughout the entire organization? How do you get to the bank teller, that person on the front line, the person who's not necessarily in a leadership position, but does impact people? What kind of decisions are they making, or how can we help them to sort of rethink the decisions that they're making so that they are actually having an impact?
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, it's natural to go to the equity sequence. I know that people need and appreciate a framework, right? At the end of the day, we can take a list of recommendations, and I'm going to take it out of the DEI consideration for a second and think about this in regards to, for example, personal health and wellness, right? Many of us have a certain degree of awareness around what kinds of things we could be doing on the daily, weekly, whatever, to improve our personal health and wellness. And that probably looks like a long list of things, right? From moving our bodies differently to fueling our bodies differently, sleeping, and so on. But for many of us, a framework that gives us a very clear and tangible thing to work through can be really helpful, because we're busy people and because the decisions we make about our health and wellness are actually quite dependent on our unconscious processes in the same way as our decisions are as well, which is why I'm going to tie this into the fact that they are our unconscious biases that can lead us to either perpetuate or create inequities in our work products and our decisions. It's not malintent most of the time, but it's what happens under the surface when we're thinking quickly, just like it does when we're thinking quickly and whatever, grab the candy bar or drive our car instead of walking, right? So when we have a framework to interrupt that quick thinking, those cognitive shortcuts, we then have an opportunity to really inject into our thinking these steps that will lead us to the outcome we want. And so at Tidal Equality, I know, Melissa, you're aware of it. We created a framework for thinking that way, and it's called the equity sequence, and it guides a person through 5 very simple, very accessible questions they can ask to help them spot where bias might live in a given decision, as well as reveal opportunities to tweak or transform that decision to be more equitable and inclusive. And so a framework can be really helpful. And I'm sure there are other frameworks out there that I would encourage people to find, but it's, when we think of behavioral science, we think of nudge theory and things like that. It can be so helpful to have something you can defer to that really does give structure to your thinking.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about the equity sequence because I think it is really interesting, and I know that you've deployed it to several organizations, and that obviously it's not industry specific or role specific. And I think one of the things we've chatted about before is the way that you frame this is that no matter your role or your rank within an organization, you can have an impact. And I think that goes back to the top of the question of when we started out with this sort of impatience and folks who want to make an impact or a change in their organization, and they may not be in an organization-wide decision-making role, but the decisions that they do make do impact other people. If you're the person who's looking at vendors, right? We've talked about that. So how does the sequence help these folks to have the impact that they may want, even if they're not in that organizational decision-making role?
That's such a good question. And as you were going over that, I thought of one that was an individual contributor in an organization. It was a retail organization, and they were actually around security and safety. And their role was to create safety plans for the brick and mortar retail locations. And you hear that and you're not thinking, whoa, DEI, straight line. But this person used the equity sequence questions when they were taking a look at how they would create those store-wide plans for safety. And this is a person who came to us with what would be considered really like rudimentary DEI knowledge. They just actually had a curiosity about how their work could be made more inclusive and a willingness to ask these questions of their work. And what they saw, again, we didn't have to tell them this. This isn't us being consultants and prescribers. What this person revealed to themselves over the course of asking these questions of this one thing, their security plan, they saw a couple of things. They saw, number one, the language that they were using in that plan was quite like able-bodied oriented. So it included instructions like run to the nearest exit, for example. Okay. But they also realized that in some of these plans that they had for brick and mortar sites, they didn't have instructions that would in any way be specialized or useful for people with any mobility issues, with people who did not have English as a first language, for people who maybe had sight impairments and so on. And so they realized, gosh, like my whole job is about people keeping them safe in the case of an emergency and making sure that they know what to do. And they were falling short on that outcome, not because they had malintent, but because as a decision maker themselves who had a certain lived experience, a certain type of perspective and purview, they weren't taking into account the experiences, perspectives, needs, desires, wants of the broadest number of their stakeholders, which look very different from them on a lot of levels. They also identified how a lot of the language in there was very technical and maybe not accessible to someone who wasn't familiar with technical language. So by identifying those action items and making tweaks to them, they not only created a safety and emergency plan that was more equitable and inclusive, but that would actually be more safe and lead to greater safety outcomes in the case of an emergency. And so that person, when you think about the changes they made, they didn't need to get, for example, leadership buy-in for a DEI initiative. They didn't need to seek permission to make these changes. They revealed these opportunities to make their plan more equitable and inclusive, but it was so directly tied to making their work just plain better that it would have been unthinkable not to make those changes. Does that make sense? So yeah, there's an example of an individual contributor in just like what you'd think of as an unrelated area from DEI. Yeah. And I could give you dozens of examples of that, of people in UX design and marketing, in legal, like you mentioned, in procurement and resourcing, where there are so many opportunities to take a look at, like, how do we do what we do here on the daily? Where are those gaps between us, the decision makers, and those on the other side, and how can we close them? And for those folks, equity sequence just gives them a really natural, logical, curiosity-based way to find those answers.
So I think that's really interesting. I kind of want to go back because I'm a historian and I love history, and I'm always interested in the history of organizations and founders. So you mentioned you've got a co-founder. Well, I'm interested in the genesis of Tidal Equality, sort of the path to the equity sequence.
Thanks for asking that. It comes down a bit to that frustration too, and impatience. And Anna Dewar-Gully, my co-founder, and I both felt that impatience. But what we felt was also a real frustration with the lack of interventions available in the DEI market that close that gap between a person or an organization's intent to be equitable and inclusive and their outcomes, their actual measurable outcomes, what stories they can tell of measurable, tangible change. There, for a long time, has been a large gap there. There's no lack of interventions that organizations can choose from, but the ones that have stories or research to demonstrate the effectiveness of those interventions is really small. And so we came together really looking at the constraints around us. What is the market purchasing? What are buyers looking for? And when we saw that what they were purchasing was ineffective, but packaged in a certain way, we were like, okay, then how can we Trojan horse as much possible equitable impact into the constraints of what's on the market? And while we started in our business offering a strategic design methodology that we called a wave, we drew on the best parts of that, which really came down to question frameworks and listening to and learning from groups and individuals who have experience of bias, discrimination, or inequality, or in the case of our discussion today, those people who are touched by, impacted by decisions that are often made by few. How do we connect those dots? And so at Tidal Equality, filling that gap for both the individual who has an intention to be more equitable, as well as the large scale organization that wants to see its people move it towards greater equity and inclusion, we wanted to touch that space with a research-backed methodology that would really be as simple and accessible to, and I'm using the climbing gym example because there really was an equity sequence learner who ran a climbing gym in Boulder, Colorado, has to be accessible to that person, and it has to be accessible to the COO of an international conglomerate as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I think there's always the question of how do we embed and imbue these ideas and these practices throughout an organization, and finding new and innovative ways to bring practices into an organization is always, I think, interesting for folks because, as I mentioned at the top, it's really important that leaders are thinking this way, but what about everyone else? How do we make this system wide? Because leaders only can do so much, because if it's trickling down, then you have to get buy-in from your managers who may not. And then you've got to make sure that it's in the employees' hands. I'm interested though in how this sort of, what is the uptake amongst people? Are they like, I'm not a change maker. Who am I to be doing this? I don't know enough about DEI. How do I actually affect change? I don't know. I hear the words anti-racism, anti-oppression, and I Google it, and I'm like, I don't know if that's me. How do we get people to buy in, or do you find that's not a challenge?
I think if I'm going to speak to those in the audience who might be asking those questions of themselves, or the people who are like, but I'm not the DEI person, for example, I alluded earlier to the fact that we created Equity Sequence to be accessible to as many people as possible. And this really comes down to what is part of social movements for change. If we think of things like the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the people who are at the roots, the grassroots of that were everyday people. Now, did those everyday people have to seek out and gain an education on systemic oppression and the real heady theoretical stuff before they could be participant in that change? No, and that's why those movements were successful. It took people who had a desire to be part of a change or to see things change for them. And we need, and I'm speaking now to DEI practitioners, we need to be able to provide people who just have a will and a desire and a curiosity to make change with something they can do now, instead of saying, hold on, just wait, not until. First, you do this. There are people who have desire and will to change. And while it's certainly important for us to have out there in the world resources and individuals and books and things that can advance our education and understanding, we also need something we can do today, because the state of equality in the world is getting worse, not better. So the greatest number of people that we can activate who have that desire and curiosity, the better. We need to have something for them. And I come back to that topic of curiosity. It's the first in our list of values at Tidal Equality, because we really do believe it takes a curiosity to be able to look at what you do, be reflective, and begin to have an opportunity to make change. And so if a person in an organization simply says, you know what, I want to be part of making a more equitable world, or making a more inclusive organization, or creating more justice, and they have a curiosity, they're willing to take a look at how is it that my decisions do or don't make the world a more inclusive or equitable place. If they've got those two ingredients and they add equity sequence to that, they will from day one be able to start identifying opportunities in their day-to-day life and decision making to start advancing equality in that way. And when you think about how broad change happens, yes, to your point and to your earlier conversations with other guests, it can supercharge change, and leaders authentically endorsing the change in their organization. That is like pouring rocket fuel on equitable change. That is not to say that a system can't change from having many people across the bottom ranks of an organization start changing the things that they do in the everyday, because the fact is those day-to-day decisions make up the systemic, right? It's a multitude of mini decisions that keep the system rolling. And I sometimes use a visual in one of my talks of a machine with cogs and gears all working together. That's what the organization is looking like. And many times those cogs and gears work together to produce good outcomes for some, not so good outcomes for others, whether we're talking about equitable advancement in an organization or equitable access to product in a customer base, you name it. We can throw a very good, I'd say, wrench in the works when we change even just one of those decisions to be more equitable and inclusive. And then the next day we make another. And the next day our colleague makes one. And we start seeing among each other how making equitable and inclusive decisions is not only better for us, but better for the people we serve. It creates that groundswell movement in an organization that can then tip the balance in favor of this kind of equitable change.
Yeah, you're speaking. Yeah, I spent many years studying social justice movements. And so I'm definitely into the idea that change can come from the bottom up. And I love the idea of empowering folks with tools so that they can actually feel effective and actually make changes in their day-to-day life. So I think the more that we can start to find ways to help people make that impact, that change begets more change, right? Because once you start to see that you are able to have an impact and that you can make a change, you want to look for other opportunities and you want to do that more. And then it becomes, once that starts to get encoded or embedded into the way that an organization works, you're not dependent on one person, dependent on a leader pushing forward a change, right? Not dependent on this one team to carry the torch. It just becomes part of the company practice. Kristen, I want to give you an opportunity to give our listeners something to take away from our conversation. We've talked a lot about, I love the idea of curiosity and that being major impetus around, or not impetus, but one of the major factors for being successful in this work is that just to have a curiosity and to wonder. If we could leave our folks with sort of one thing to take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
I think it comes back to my earlier question to your audience is, if you make decisions that impact people, do you make decisions that impact people? And if you do, does not matter what rank you're in, what role you have, what sector you serve in, what the size of your business, whether it's flashy or not, if you make decisions that impact people, they can be made more equitable to benefit the broader picture of equitable change. And I really want to emphasize how small the decision could be. I mean, we had a leader at a business. She was just learning equity sequence. It's a thing you can learn in 2.5 hours, but even by the end of your learning phase, you've practiced it on something real. And so even as she was just completing her learning, she applied it to her Friday stand-up meetings with her team. she just, thinking about it just really quickly, not going into depth or anything like that, realized, you know what, I'm hosting my meetings on Zoom between 3 and 4 p.m. This may not be a great time for the parents on my team. Maybe they have to pick kids up from school, or maybe their kids are walking home from the bus and walking into the house. Maybe this is why cameras are off so often. She just thought about it from the angle of one type of participant in her meeting, and that was parents. She shifted that meeting closer to midday on a Friday in consideration of that. And what she saw very quickly was more engagement in those calls, more cameras were on, which I'm not speaking to whether that's important or not, but to her it was on those team meetings, more engagement. And she heard from her team appreciation that they had moved the time away from that end of the school day time slot. That is an incredibly small tweak that made a difference both to the engagement and culture on her team. Now imagine the impact that little decision can have if it is then shared at scale across a business. Small decisions, when shared, can have massive impact. Think too about how an organization runs their annual conference and the ways somebody might tweak that conference to be more equitable and inclusive, whether we're talking about ensuring there's kosher food or there's a breastfeeding space, or these kinds of micro decisions that get made about things that happen again and again when shared can have massive impact. So what I would challenge your audience with is when and if you find a way to make what you do more equitable and inclusive, whether you're using the equity sequence or you've had some other insight, share that insight. Then that can be adopted and scaled elsewhere. People who have your role can try it and see if it works in their workplace. But I think to the point that brought us here, which is frustration and impatience, to make change faster and at scale, we have to make it more accessible, more effective, and we need to tell the story of that change so others can make it too.
That's amazing. I don't even think I have anything else to add to that, because I think that sums up what I was hoping our conversation would be today, is how can we help organizations? How can we help organizations start to think about change at scale? And how can we do this in an effective way? How can we do this in a way that isn't onerous and that can lead to real, tangible, measurable outcomes and change? Kristen, for those who are interested in learning more about your work or want to keep up with you, where can they go?
I love to be connected with on LinkedIn. It's my favorite place for connecting with curious people. And for those who are curious also about equity sequence, you can just Google that and you'll find it by Googling equity sequence. But yeah, very happy to have any curious folks out there reach out to myself or the team at Tidal Equality to learn more.
Perfect. And we'll definitely include Kristen's contact details, LinkedIn, and where you can find Tidal Equality as well. As always, if you have any of your own questions or you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Kristen, thank you so much for having this conversation today, and I'm hoping that we've piqued folks' curiosity. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.